Today we're going to talk about some of my favorite 2d6 tables. Those of you who are following along week to week know that today I was supposed to do the solo RPG thing. I didn't get as much time to work on sort of the dungeon crawly bit that I wanted to, because I found a way, I believe, that I can do sort of a iterative sort of solo dungeon crawl just with the stuff that I have kind of cobbled together. So I didn't need to go like pick out a big map and do that layout. So I'm going to try that. There's just a few more tweaks I didn't feel super comfortable about doing today. So I'm going to jump forward and do the next video that I was already working on. So let's do that, which is the 2d6 tables. So let's see, where do we want to start? Where do we want to start? So I guess we should start talking about primarily 2d6 tables and what they're about and why you might want to use them, why I think a lot of people do use them. So 2d6 tables are different than just like any other sort of roll table, right? You grab a die, you roll it, you consult the chart as a DM or GM, Dungeon Master, or Game Master. When you need that sort of little extra random flair, when you need something that can sort of like kickstart your mind a little bit when you're working on things. And these can both be sort of like world building tables, they can be sort of adventure tables, or they can be sort of improvised scene things. So they could be dungeon dressings or whatever, random encounter charts, all that sort of stuff. And so the difference is sort of why would you want to use something like 2d6 rather than, let's say, the most equivalent die would be sort of 1d12. So, and that's all about probability. It's about the curve. And it's the reason, when you take math in school, and, the teachers would always tell you algebra or calculus or anything like that, like you're going to need that in your everyday life. I think, unless you have a very specific career, you probably don't use most of that math in your life. But I did take statistics, and that one is something that I found actually that math is exceptionally more useful in the sort of day-to-day life, and with something like D&D, like sort of understanding more the normal curve, bell curve kind of weighted distribution versus sort of normal distribution, and the outliers and things of that nature. So that's been exceedingly helpful for me in both professionally and just in things like D&D as a hobby. So yeah, that's sort of what we're going to look at. So weighted distribution just means that instead of sort of when you roll a d20, right, numbers 1 through 20, they all have a 5% chance of showing up. So when you do weighted curves, it's more likely you're going to have the middle results, extremely less likely you're going to have the end results. And 2d6, while it's technically not a normal bell curve, is very close to that shape without adding more options than you might need for a table. The midpoint of which is, of course, 7. And that leaves us on the far outliers of 2 and 12 when it comes to the table. And everything else is kind of smattered in the middle. So this could be really useful, especially for doing things like random encounter tables, things of that nature, where you want to put some fun, wacky stuff in a random encounter table for when the characters are going through the haunted woods or whatever it is. And you want there to be like a ghost encounter, but you don't want it to be as equally likely that there's going to be a ghost encounter as, say, zombies. Or something like that, skeletons, things like that. So those would be the ones that you would put more towards the center, in that sort of 5 through 9 slots, where those things are a lot more common to show up. And I think even at 7, you're looking at almost a third, if I remember the math correctly. Almost a third of it's going to be 7. So if you want it to be the most common thing that shows up, so maybe for that sort of forest, maybe that's like a will-o'-the-wisp sort of situation, you want to throw that in 7, and then some of those sort of common undeads around it, and then maybe the more specific and dangerous undead sort of at the far ends. Maybe, your things like your ghast, your ghouls, your shadows, those ghosts, things of that nature, banshees. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of the overall concept, and why I like them is one of the reasons I like them as a DM is First, I have a pretty good idea of what's going to come up on the dice most of the time. So that's always fun. It makes it a little bit easier to sort of improvise when you know it's more likely that you're going to have that will-o-the-wisp skeleton or zombie encounter, and it's less likely that you're going to have to come up with a lot of reasons for there to be shadows in this forest. Something like that. So that's really useful for me. And I use both. I have normally distributed roll tables and sort of flat roll tables as well. I use both of them, and I think you should. It's just, it kind of depends on what sort of results, what sort of theme you're trying to go for. So do you want it to be, it's going to seem more random the sort of flatter that distribution tends to be. So I think the first thing we want to do is, so I'm going to jump into one of the ones that I've been using for a while now. And it's actually a revision of, I think it's Spencer's basic. And that is dungeon stocking tables. So I took those tables, which is usually just I think it's just a 1d6 die in the original one, and changed it up a little bit better for sort of my use. So let me get over here to our document so you guys can see it, and I'll type some of this stuff out so you'll be able to reference it. Go over here. There we go. So this one is a little different. And not all these 2d6 tables are, like I said, that normal distribution. This one's actually a completely flat distribution. You're just going to roll 2 6-sided dice for it and combine the results. So this one is empty. So this tells you, this is what I use to kind of tell me what's going to be in any sort of dungeon chamber when I'm making it. And this is one of the things I was using a lot. I said I was doing that prep for our solo dungeon crawl. And so this is one of the tables I was using a whole bunch to sort of test it. And if you guys, if once I get it finished and tune in probably next week, you'll be able to see me like use it in action, like to create a dungeon chamber on the fly and stock it with something. Yeah, so we can do that, or it's like a stocking table. So first result, it's empty. Second result, it's empty, but with a treasure. Third is hot, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I'll just put we'll put a little asterisk there. Hot. And then 4 is hot, but with a treasure. Start to see a theme. This is creature. This is creature, the treasure. And that's it. That's the table. So I roll twice on that table and combine the effects. And we'll do that in just a second with just some examples to kind of show you what we're doing. We'll do a handful of examples, show kind of how it works. So it's very quick, right? You grab 2 dice, roll it. Going to tell you the basics about what's in every single sort of location or scene or dungeon chamber. Right? I use it in the dungeon. I use it out of the dungeon for random scenes, things like that. It's very useful. So hot. What does that mean? It means hazard, obstacle, trick, or trap. So yeah, it's basically going to be a non-combat, non-social encounter if you come up with a hot in it. And I put those all together because that's, for me, that's dependent on what's actually, what the condition of the dungeon is or the location. So if the dungeon's like a crumbling ruin, you're probably going to have, in my mind, more hazards and obstacles than tricks and traps. So that's the sort of thing. Or if you're storming like a in-use fortress, maybe it's brand new castle or something like that, it's going to be 100% tricks or traps. There's no going to be any sort of like crumbling walkways or chasms that have opened up, rifts that have opened up in the middle of chambers or anything like that. So none of that. So yeah, that's sort of how it works. Let me get to check just one thing, and then I'll get that. Let me get the dice pulled up. Hold on just a second. There we go. So like I said, let's roll a few examples. All right, so I rolled a 3 and a 4. I know these pretty much off the top of my head, but we'll go back. So, hot and a hot treasure. So what happens when it shows us something like this right off the top? So let's do this. Let's do our examples. So when I do that, it's usually I do this, and we go to treasure. So a double up can either mean I kind of do two things with it, and usually I'll just roll another d6. So if it's low, it's mini. If it's high, it means it's a bad one. Which means it's more severe. It's exceedingly dangerous sort of situation. And of course, I have some sort of I do have a sort of list in my DM's guide of just sort of basic traps and basic hazards and obstacles. So I have those. So I have random roll tables that I can grab dice, roll on, and I can figure out what it is really quick. So if this was some, let's say it's a dwarven ruin, this has some very big, nasty trap that's in it. Which means it's probably a trap that does something like gives a pretty debilitating condition, or does a curse, or maybe does a whole bunch of damage, hits really hard. So things like that. And then for a little one result treasure, like this, I usually do something on sort of my minor treasure table. Roll something like that. This is something you find in here. It might be it's on a corpse, might be if there's creatures you find, maybe it's in their pockets. It could also be scattered somewhere or hidden behind a block or something, somebody's sort of like personal little hidey hole in the dungeon, something like that. So you can kind of pepper them through. And most of the minor treasure isn't worth a whole lot of actual money most of the time. So it's fine to have these in a whole bunch of different rooms across the dungeon, across the adventure, even if because the way that it's set up, right? If we look at our D6 table, there's about a 50% chance that each room's going to have some sort of treasure in it. Actually, probably better than that. It's going to have some sort of treasure in it, and then right, we have that treasure times 2. So either there's going to be a number of different treasures, or usually if that's a treasure times 2 at this point, I basically mean that there's some sort of magical treasure there. Most of the time, that's a potion or scroll, something that's a one-use sort of consumable item. But there is sort of a ranking up where it can be something that can be used, has a number of charges on it, something that has a recharge on it, something that has multiple uses on it, and then of course at the sort of top end of that spectrum are sort of permanent items that never run out. So your sort of basic magic swords, magic armor, etc., things like that. And then we do sort of the same thing for the rarity. So rarity, whether that's common, uncommon, rare, very rare, or legendary. To use the sort of 5e structure for magic items, anyways. So yeah, so that's an example. Let's do like 5. These are pretty easy to plow through, so we can do a few of them. Let's say this is like a Fey forest. We're gonna say that's what this dungeon is that we're rolling in for the scene in. Okay, so a 4 and a 2, so that means 2 is empty with treasure, 4 is hot with treasure. Another thing that I like about this sort of system is that you see we could have hot and treasure, and that could have been one roll and empty, or so the way that you can have different combinations that kind of end up to the same result. I like as Dungeon Master because it means that it's a little bit more difficult, I feel like, for the players to sort of meta knowledge that sort of thing. Not that I think most do, but some, it becomes harder to pick up patterns, whether they're actively trying to do it or not actively do it. When you're able to come up with the same result with different things, that's really important when you have things that are like empty rooms with treasure in them, and the treasure ends up being hidden, or there's hidden doors, secret doors, things of that nature. So it makes it really easy to sort of do that part. And without them feeling like they understand what's going to be in every room based off their first look. So that was hidden treasure. So we said sort of a fey wood. So what would be? That seems like more of a hazard or obstacle route. I should have brought my thing in here. Maybe there's sort of like a slumbering fairy ring that kind of does like a sleep spell kind of thing. That could be very interesting. That's really, really hard to get through. Maybe it's more of a sort of like skill challenge kind of thing where they just have to persist across sort of this open glade that's got a Lotus Eaters kind of thing where they keep having to fight against being falling asleep, except for maybe they have that one elf in their party who's immune to sleep and is able to sort of like give different people advantage on their saves and things like that to try to get out, try to help carry them out. So, right, pretty easy to make these things. Treasure for that red-eyed roll on the table is probably going to be some sort of pocket content, something that's left on like a skeleton who starved in there beforehand. Or fell asleep and starved. As you see, pretty easy to make these. Let's try to get something that doesn't have maybe a hot in it. Well, not that. Alright, 6 and 1, there we go. So that gives us an empty, 1 is empty, and then 6 is creature with treasure. And so really just when you double up, you're just determining, I'm usually just determining whether there's a lot of monsters, if we roll it for creatures, or it's a very powerful monster sometimes solo, sometimes sort of a powerful encounter, like a kind of a deadly encounter. Or potentially deadly encounter. Because creature doesn't necessarily mean combat. It's important to remember that. It usually does, but not always. Especially if I'm doing these and PCs have run through like maybe 2 or 3 dungeon chambers that have creatures in that they fought in a row, I might decide that, the next random one I roll up, this one's going to be more of sort of a talky encounter. There's sort of like a neutral party, a trader, or some sort of other NPC, or maybe a slave that would love to be freed, or something like that. It can be sort of a neutral person, or an ally, or something like that. That's not a direct threat, unless, of course, the players decide to make them a threat. Then that's something else, I guess. So let's go. So that's sort of a creature and treasure. Let's say this could be a very simple like river crossing encounter. If we wanted to take it out of the dungeon, do something that's sort of outside. So right there's somebody on the bridge charging a toll for it. They've got in the treasure, right? This is a minor treasure. Maybe they've got some coins that they've taken off of the toll they have charged, peasants and paupers. So they don't have a ton of money on them, but they have some. Something like that. Let's say this is for this dungeon. It's going to be sort of like a ancient, like Warforged automaton repository, like library kind of thing. Like it's sort of an archives, a dangerous archives they're plumbing. It's got a bunch of constructs and things like that in it. So that's sort of the thing we're going to go for this one. Alright, 1 and 4. Well, like I said, I don't want to keep doing... That's kind of the same thing over and over again. Okay, so here we go. So this is 4 is a hot treasure and 5 is a creature. So now we have one where we have some mixing going up. We've got a hot and we've got a treasure. So I might want to determine, okay, so what is the status of this dungeon? Because I'm kind of doing it randomly on the fly. And I am just going to roll 2d6. Like I said, I have another table for this. Oh, okay. Alright. It's actually in extremely good condition. So it's most likely that this is going to be a trap. Let's double check. Yeah. Okay. Only on a 9 or 10 would have been a hazard. And that can still be like a trap that is malfunctioning, which makes it more dangerous in a lot of ways. So, and we need a creature, so some sort of automated, I'm thinking sort of like crossbow, bolter, arcane, magic missile kind of flinging turret. It's sort of automated. And then a creature that's in there is some sort of brass clockwork spider that like climbs up and down the the bookcases of the archive, and has probably like pinchy, really bad like pinchery clamps and stuff like that. And then for the treasure, I mean, I think if you're going to be in sort of like an archive like this at Scriptorium, it's got to be some probably maybe not a scroll, but some sort of important piece of knowledge, a clue about something that they're going to find that's going to help them either in the dungeon or in whatever the reason they're in the dungeon for. So whether it's going to help them get through the dungeon or something about gives them some sort of context for maybe the artifact they're seeking or whatever reason they are plumbing this sort of construct archive. And for this last one, let's do something very natural. Let's do like a sea cave. One and a three. Alright, well, it's empty except for some treasure. Or no, so that was 3, not a 2, right? Okay. It's got a hot in it. So it's just that. So we said sea cave, so probably some sort of hazard. I'm thinking sort of like a backdraft, sort of like sucking riptide current. There's water puddles sort of across the bottom of the sea cave. Somebody steps in the wrong one, it kind of tries to suck them out into the water down below where they can, drown or something like that. That'd be fun. And that's all that's in that room, basically. There's nothing else going on in there. It's just one of those rooms that you need to get through. There's not really anything to keep you here, so the less time you spend in here, the better. So the characters are rushing through it. Or being very careful if they think they're about to get ambushed. Which can have its own problems, which might make it easier. They might have to roll more than once for this sort of sucking hazard. Maybe it's sort of a larger pool or a number of larger pools that have sort of a funneling effect. It kind of sucks somebody down into it. But yeah, I mean, that's it. This is a super easy table. You just take 2d6, you roll on it and combine the results. I've been using it for years. It works really well for me. Like I said, it's an offshoot of the basic BX sort of dungeon stocking table, which is also a D6 table. I didn't quite like how that one worked, so I just took it and tweaked it a little bit, and then added sort of a second D6 to it to sort of combine those things, so I could get something that wasn't just like creature or creature and treasure. So that way I could have sort of mixed environments that had obstacles and creatures in it, or lots of really could have a big sort of stack of treasure that's in an empty room, and then the fun that kind of goes into players trying to figure out why there's a big stack of unattended treasure, those sorts of things. So like I said, just combining it, like doubling up things, so that on empty it's either empty or it's not. So one empty or two empties doesn't really make a difference. Hot, like I said, it either means that there's multiple traps or hazards or obstacles, or there's one really kind of severe one. Treasures, it's either a minor treasure or sort of a major treasure, usually a magic item if I get double up on treasures. Or I can roll with advantage, or double up sort of minor treasure. But generally, I'll just decide that there is going to be a magic item in there. And then double up creatures, that's either can be sort of a mob of creatures or a much more severe bad guy. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to have multiple sort of factions in a dungeon. It's nice to have those. And so if I get a creature times 2, like a double up on a creature in a chamber, I can actually have 2 factions who are maybe in tense negotiations, maybe they're meeting together for some sort of council, maybe they're just all on the verge of fighting or already fighting when the sort of player characters come across them, when the party comes across them. And so just to make things a little bit more dynamic, or to showcase that, hey, you can see that these factions are opposed to each other, at least in some form or fashion. Or maybe they're cooperative. Maybe that's what they find out. Maybe that they walk in there and feel like, oh, well, these two factions seem to have a strong tie, so it's going to be really difficult to sort of break them up. So if there's another third or more faction in there, maybe that's the one I focus on. So that is our dungeon stocking tables. Very super simple. For our next one, let's do our biome variation table. This is one of the ones that I do get some questions about. And if you've watched any of the solo RPG stuff or any of the sort of hex map building stuff, you've probably seen me reference the photo I'm about to show. And maybe you've scratched your head because it's not exactly the most user-friendly image, and I haven't really explained it. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Table. And I'll show you the picture of it, so I'm probably not going to write anything down here. And I did prep an example to kind of show why we use it the way we use it, or why I use it the way in its current incarnation. So those who have been watching the solo RPG stream, especially, have probably seen me kind of come across this. So this is for my own use. This is fully personal use. It's so contracted that it kind of requires explaining to use, which is why I haven't really gone through it on any of the streams. But this is my biome variation table. I roll a 2d6 on it. You can see the sort of table on the right, and then on the left is sort of an example reference for me about sort of what that result means. So the biome roll is very, very simple. It's basically the way that I use it, the variation table, the way that I use it is that if I have a parent hex, so I'm usually detailing hexes within hexes, those nested hexes ideas. I have a big video about it. Sure, so go check that out if you're interested in this. So a parent hex has a number of sub-hexes in it, and so this is sort of figuring, this table is to figure out what the biomes of those sub-hexes. Because it's much easier than instead of just having all just uniform biomes across the board, kind of give it some variation to make it feel like more is going on. But we use that 2d6, so it's got sort of that not flat distribution, right? We have that pointed distribution. So the thing that's most likely to come up most of the time is that primary biome with the parent hex. So that's why we use it. And it's super simple, right? This is the 8 through 6 is the same as the parent biome, so let's pick a parent biome. Let's say, let's go with plains. That's very easy, grasslands. So that would be sort of these guys right here. And let's say it's temperate, so this guy. Temperate, and then we roll some 2d6. I'm not going to switch the camera over for that. You'll just have to trust my roll. I rolled a 6. Okay. So that just means, hey, more grassland. That's all that means. There we go. Just means more grassland. Let me roll until I get something else. That's a 7. That's a 6. 8. 9. Okay, so 9. So when we see 9, if we go down to our handy dandy little chart on the right, we see that that's +1. Verdant, sometimes I use, it's more lifeful. I don't know. That doesn't really feel like the right word. Verdant was the closest I could kind of get to. Usually it means that it's got more greenery in it, usually. So plains, if we go one more verdant than that, which is a step this way, it's wetter with precipitation. It's trending more towards water than desert. We see that it's sort of like a light forest, so that's like a 50% forest, 50% sort of grassland, so sort of a broken grassland woods area. And I use this sometimes for solo hex crawling. So I could start off in that plane and be like, oh, then the next plane you went to roll the 2d6. Oh, that was a plane. Rolled again. Oh, it was a light forest this time, so now it's a more wooded area. And then once I'm in that light wooded forest, that becomes the new sort of parent hex for rolling it. And so if I did that, I rolled a 4, which if we look here, is 2 more barrens. So I went from that sort of grassland into this light forest, and then it stepped back down to into sort of this broken sort of scrub land with a bunch of sort of rocks and not a bunch of sort of dry, scraggly bushes, and not a lot of sort of grass. And so you can do that. The only problem with doing that, or not really problem, is more of a sort of flavor, is that it's going to make the your sort of biomes, like as you map larger and larger and larger, they're going to seem a lot more sort of hectic feeling. They're not going to feel as realistic, I guess, if you're worried about that. Which certainly I am sometimes, so sometimes I don't do it, sometimes I do. It kind of depends on the game and the feeling for the game. So, yeah, there's not much to it. I mean, that's sort of, I guess we went through the middle. We went through the middle, and then it's pretty easy to understand verdant or barren. You just move it up or down the scale. And you see the way that this table is broken down, it's a quick look table, so it also has the hills on here, but this is not sort of like one uniform line. Like, you don't get to desert, and then if you roll more barren, you start turning it into hills and mountains. That's not how it's meant to be used. Hills and mountains are kind of off doing their own thing. We can look through it. So the way that I do it is that if I roll, 2 6s, 12, that's always going to be a water hex for me. And that could end up being a coastal hex, that could end up being sort of like a lake or a pond or an inland sea, kind of depending on the scale we're working with. If I roll 11, that's always going to be a wetland, so that's always going to be some sort of swamp or bog or mire or fen, anything of that nature, marsh. And then anything that's +2 verdant, right, we move. If we're doing the flat sides, right, we're not doing the hills, then it's moving 2 to the left, which will eventually, again, this is not a super great reference for anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, but then it would go from, say, this light forest to medium forest to heavy forest, and then it would actually go to swamp. And then after swamp, it would go to water. So you kind of go water, swamp, heavy forest, medium forest, light forest, grasslands, scrub, desert. And that's sort of the linear continuum. Because you can't really have anything that's more barren than desert. You can't really have anything that's more verdant or wet than water. And then I do the different sort of bands, tropical, temperate, taiga sort of zones, to determine what trees show up there. You also notice over here on sort of the hillside and the mountainside is that when we hit the mountains, it actually it bumps it up into the next sort of bands, mountains, because mountains, latitude, as you go up in latitude in mountains, the air gets cooler, so you can have, that's why sort of steppe farming was so successful, especially sort of in South America. It's because you have sort of tundra, and then as you go up the mountains, you get that temperate zone, and then you can go all the way up to sort of taiga, depending on how tall the mountains are. So this is just sort of to kind of reflect that and kind of tell you what would be there. So if you're looking for a source of hardwood in the middle of a jungle, you know that you need to find some sort of mountainous area, and you should be able to find that. If for some reason that's important to your D&D game. I don't know if it is or not. It might be. So if so, that's why it's there. And then of course when you get down here, at the very bottom, this means that it's sort of beyond the tree line. It's so cold that it's just sort of a bald mountain at that point. And every time you roll mountains, there's a 10% chance it's going to be a volcano. That's just something fun to add in. And when you roll mountains on the mountain biome, you get yourself a nice little snowy peak. So if you roll a 2 when you're already in the mountains biome, that's going to be a snowy peak. It means it's a very tall mountain. That's it. So why do I use the super condensed one? Because clearly it's not super straightforward for a lot of people. It's because sort of the alternative kind of looks like this. Like if I actually completely put it out, That's kind of what it looks like. Which is not the most useful thing in the world. Not the most user-friendly thing in the world. And this is only the tropical biome. So I would have to redo this again. So there would have to be a separate chart also for the temperate zone, and a separate chart sort of for the boreal Arctic, subarctic zone. And this is just everything that we had. It's just mapped out this time, though. So if we were in that scrub and we rolled that 2d6, if we rolled that middle range, where we're going to get the scrub, then we're going to get some deserts over here. But even on this one, right, I still did hills and mountains. I just input them as their own sort of separate lines because I kind of have to do that. And so there's different types of hills. So this is sort of grass hills. This is scrub hills, desert hills, and then tropical forest hills. There are forest hills for the other sort of bands as well. But it's very, very straightforward. 6 through 8, a hill is a dale. So, but it is, a lot to keep track of. So I understand this is why I don't use this chart, because it's way more than I need as a reference. But I understand why, as an audience member from the outside, you look at this and you're like, this is not super useful. The table, however, is useful. You just kind of have to fill in the little parts. And like I said, it's very simple to do. You're just basically going from water to desert. So again, we can look at this. It's sort of the fullest gamut you can. You can see it does these diagonal lines across. It gives you a good idea of basically what it looks like. So water to wetlands to heavy forest, medium forest, light forest, plains, scrub, desert. And that's it. That's all you need to know about it. That's what I was saying was run the 6 through 8 on the hills. So if you roll a 3 on a hills, which was already hills, then that's a dale. So correct on this one. I don't know why I wrote the wrong thing on the other one. I must have been thinking about something else. And then the same thing happens for mountains. Alright, so that's sort of the biome variation table. Let me swap our look back over. So yeah, this is the 2d6 biome variation table, and we can just write it out really quickly. Parent or previous hex, if you were doing sort of just a straight up hex crawl. If you're not using sort of a top-down nested hex mapping, if you just want to grab some dice and start rolling a random hex crawl, then you can just use the previous hex for that. Then we get to 11, and 11 is, of course, always a wetland. Now, this does end up with some interesting things, because you can end up in sort of if you have let's say a desert parent biome, still remember that every time you roll 11 or 12, you're basically going to be putting down water or wetland. So it might be, this kind of tells you sort of where your oases are, and that water might be like a salt lake as well. It might not necessarily, it might be like a Dead Sea or a salt lake, something that's not going to be like potable water, like they can't drink it or anything like that. It's got the salinity of it is way too high. And so this could be basically or woody. So woody would be swamp. Grassy would be sort of a marsh. Usually if it's in the middle of a forest or something, it's probably just going to be a freshwater. But it could also be sort of an abandoned quarry, right? Something like that would count for as sort of a water feature like that. Anything of that nature. Any sort of body of water, basically. So this is another one that I get asked about pretty regularly. So the weird thing about the pocket contents table is that, for as far as the 2d6 chart is that unlike this isn't actually a table. It's well, I mean, technically it is a table. It is specifically a table. It's not lit, is what I'm trying to say. It's like a little matrix. So we're gonna actually need to make a table. So again, this is just pocket content. So I roll 1d6 to do sort of rows and 1d6 to do columns. It'll be very obvious. Accessory, ADC or everyday carry, food, item, money, or paper. So that's sort of the 1 through 6 that I have for the rows. And there's sort of categories. Don't technically need this one, but I think it's helpful because sometimes I'll come across something where the result won't work perfectly or it doesn't really make sense. And so having like sort of a category at the top helps. I feel like gives me a little bit to go off of when the specific example I roll up doesn't end up working very well. I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a second once we get these done. Why is it doing that? There. Looking at those questions. Let's go down. So clothing. So yeah, if I roll a 1 and then I roll something else, that's like, oh well, it's some accessory they end up finding. So it could be a bit of clothing, can be something that's totally not worth anything. It could be just a tattered scarf, or maybe it's one boot. This is the good thing to be able to sort of. These are good things to be able to, if they don't provide monetary value, provide some sort of clues or context for the history of what's going on, especially in the dungeon, because usually when I use this is for dungeon chambers, for those sort of minor treasures. Pocket contents is one of the things that can come up. So doing something like this and be like, oh, well, you find a tattered scarf, or maybe it's a tattered scarf that's covered in sort of like a pollen, and maybe that's telegraphing a sort of hazardous pollen or mold or something of that nature that's deeper within the dungeon somewhere. Do something like that. Fetish, they might have some sort of like religious symbol with them. It could be sort of whether that's sort of like an amulet, or maybe it's like a good luck token, something of that nature. Just a gemstone, right? That might be something they have on them. Maybe it could be part of jewelry, but it could also be maybe the jewelry's not very useful or isn't very good, and so that's actually not worth anything. But the gemstone is actually of decent quality, something of that nature. Or it might just be that they have a little sapphire or something that's been sewn into the hem of their cuff or something. As a way to sort of carry some money on them inconspicuously. A lens, that could be anything like glasses, things of that nature, goggles, magnifying glass, telescope, a jeweler's loupe, like a reading glass. Like one of the things that monks used to do is they used to have clear bottles with a little bit of water in them, and using the magnification process of the water, they would use that for illuminating their scripts because they could use it as sort of like a super cheap magnifier. Something of that nature. And then, of course, they might have just a weapon on them. Let's do, so this is everyday carry, which could have included the weapon. Didn't put it in this one, though. So some sort of gamer tool. And these don't have to be concrete ideas. So if I roll a knife, it doesn't necessarily have to be a knife. But the idea is that it is a very sort of simple tool that somebody would have on them. So if you were, say, in ancient dwarven mines or something, instead of a knife, it might just be a different sort of tool, but you could also use that for one. So it kind of depends. But it could be like a pick or the miner's thing that you can hammer into a wall and put a candle on. I forget what the name of it is. But something like that, or one of the caps that has a little reflector things for a stuff candle to be on. But you might also use that for pocket lamp. Just in general, pocket lamp is usually like sometimes they're called thumb lamps. They're just little tiny lamps. Sometimes they're clay. They're usually oil lamps, clay, or they could be like a little alcohol torch or something like that. Thing is, or it could even be just a stub of candle. It's just they have some sort of light source. Same way that people might carry a little flashlight with them or something like that, if they don't want to use their phone light. And then 6 is a wax tablet. It could be a notepad. Notepads aren't really a concept in sort of that era of historical anachronism that D&D kind of holds, so having sort of just a flip notepad doesn't really make sense. But it could be sort of like a wax tablet or something like that. Or it could be a stick with tally marks on it. It could be anything of that nature. So as you can see, like with the tools and the knife, there's some overflow between these things, which is kind of nice. So usually it's just they have a little bit of food on them in some form or fashion that you find in their sort of pockets, some sort of snack or something they have. It's not like rations, it's just sort of a snack that they might have on them. But it might give you some indication about who they are or something of that nature. Or if you want to, depending on how you're feeling as Dungeon Master, or depending on how well or poorly your dungeon delvers are doing in your dungeon, you might decide that, hey, this would maybe help supplement your rations. If they're running low on rations and you're like, well, I don't want you guys to abandon the dungeon maybe in the middle of a session, but also to go back to town to get more rations. But also, I still want you guys to feel sort of the pressure of it and give you a little bit of reward. I might be like, oh, well, this supplements a little bit of your rations. Like, you find enough jerky that's going to help stretch out your rations a little bit more and maybe give them a pass on using rations for the day or something. So it could be candy, could be carbs. That could be anything. That could be bread. It could be like onigiri, like rice balls. It could just be oats for oatmeal to be made later. It could be a rind of cheese. Could be fresh fruit. Could be dried fruit. Could be something in syrup. So I guess I could put veg here as well, because this could also be things like pickles, pickled goods that they might have on them. And jerky, so some sort of dried meat, usually. So that could be, of course, meat jerky, but it could also be dried fish, things of that nature. Then nuts and seeds. Could be sunflower seeds, peanuts, all sorts of things they might have in their pocket. And this is a good way, so I really like the food table because it's an interesting way to sort of add some world building aspect if you want to think about very specific things that they might have access to. So depending on where they are, I might for, let's say, jerky, because jerky feels like the best category for it. Either jerky or fruit and veg. One of those two. Maybe. Be like, no, they don't have any meat or vegetables on them, but they do. You seem to have some prepared, like, dried tree bark, like birch bark, something like that. That's something that people can eat and provides nourishment. But it's kind of tells you a little bit about like people living here and how they might help them scavenge for supplies, forage for supplies if they need it in the forest later on. They can find a birch tree or something like that. Especially with birch, because just about every part of the birch tree is edible for at least for humans. So items they might have on them. So these are sort of kind of like almost vanity items that they might have on them. That you might find randomly. You might find a flask. Might be alcohol. Might be. I'm probably not going to give you an alchemist flask for pocket contents, but I might if I felt like it was very specifically useful for something that's coming up in the dungeon to help maybe telegraph something. So maybe you find it, and it might not be like a full thing. It might just be something they investigate and get maybe a little taste of, and they're like, no, it's not wine, it's or hard liquor, it's tarry, it's like alchemist fire, but there's not very much left in this flask. Maybe I'm like telegraphing a troll encounter or something that's coming up. Something where fire is going to be useful. Kind of give them that indication. Key. This is a great one that can do basically two things as Dungeon Masters. Two really cool things. Is one, it's either going to give the players a very easy way to resolve something they're really struggling with. So whether that's a locked door or a trapped chest or something like that, be like, hey, you literally found the key to this thing already. But it can also be a nice sort of offshoot, because it's going to make, if they haven't found a chest or something like that, that clues them in that, hey, maybe it's time to start looking for, maybe there's some sort of secret passages, some secrets we've missed. Maybe we're going to need to look a little bit closer for things to figure out what this key goes to, especially if it's not labeled. Or it can be sort of a quest item. Maybe it's got something engraved in it that tells you what the key goes to, and the key doesn't go to anything in this dungeon. So maybe it's a tip a clue for maybe their next adventure location, maybe something back in town, maybe it's got like a last name on something on it, and it can just sort of be its own adventure scene. And when they get back to town, they can start asking people about the name on this and find out that it's from a nearby noble family that line is passed and they are no longer among the living. And they're like, oh well, maybe there's a haunted castle or something to go check out. So very easy to sort of spin that off into its own adventure if you want it, and a lot of this pocket content stuff can do that. Well, we'll see that in just a second because, well, like, just talk about it now because think about it. So in this money section, this is how we kind of came up with the goblin idea. That we're about to go into the dungeon in the solo RPG series at this point. Is that we kept finding platinum pieces. We found platinum pieces on knoll, like Wasteland Raider knolls, and they're like, oh, well, they have a foreign printing on them because that, for whatever reason, kind of made more sense as to why they might have them. And so that's kind of been the spur for this new adventure, is figuring out the sort of foreign power and what they're doing with this confederation of orcs and gnolls and goblins all together who all showed up with these platinum pieces, minted in a different kingdom. So that's sort of that idea. So it's very cool. They might have medicine on them. Incense. Incense is usually just worth money, but it could have some sort of religious significance or something of that nature. Medicine, maybe they have some sort of condition. This maybe gives you another charge back to a healer's kit or something like that if you want to do that. You want to give them something mechanical to do with it. It can be narcotics. So I also usually throw alcohol into this sort of situation as well, but it could be tobacco or milk of the poppy. It could be all sorts of weird stuff. It might be weird magical like mage burn stuff. That mages, drugs for spellcasters that allow them to do things they otherwise wouldn't be able to do with their magic. And then perfume, right? Smell goods kind of falls under incense. When I talked about aromatics, kind of putting those together. Because perfume is usually vanity related, not always. Whereas incense can be vanity, but it can also be sort of religious and significance. No, perfume can too with sensors. Uh, you know, it's just however you want to flavor it. And then money is, it's just basically you find a pouch on this person. If it's a dead body or hidden somewhere, like I said, you can have those little hidey holes. They find maybe they, right, if you roll a key and then maybe you also roll some money, maybe they're like, oh, you find a key, and after a little bit of extra searching, you find like a battered sort of like cash box under a bunk or something like that, and it's got, let's say what I'm doing here, 2d10 silver pieces in it, so it's sort of like their little piggy bank savings. And then we have, so again, the point is that it's not supposed to be very much money. That's why it's not more hidden away. It's not like you're gonna trip over pocket contents, random loot, minor loot of 100+ gold pieces. I say that, but I mean I guess technically if you rolled a 6 and rolled a 10 on your platinum pieces, that would be 100 gold. Which is again sort of what happened in the solo RPG thing. We kept rolling this on pocket contents results, and so I just kind of made a story beat out of it because it kept showing up. Pulling that sort of order out of randomness, taking something that continues to show up to the point of feeling like it's not random anymore, and then transitioning it into being not random, to having some sort of important effect on the story or what's going on. And then for papers, a banknote is another one of my favorites. So this column's pretty fun. I like to use this pretty interesting pretty often. Actually, we're talking about the solo RPG stuff and platinum piece results. We also got one of the things that kicked us off was actually not this. It was actually this. Is we found this on a dead body. I don't even remember where. And it must have been goblins. Must have been a random encounter or something out on the road, I think. And we found a map in Goblin, which led us to where we are now in the solo RPG, that finding out that sort of confederation between goblins and orcs and gnolls with this foreign currency sort of backing them. That all came from finding a random map that was And because I didn't know what it was going to be to, I just said, oh, it's written in Goblin, so you can't read it, because nobody in the party could read Goblin. So you're going to have to go find somebody to read it for you. So give myself a little time to kind of percolate, my brain to percolate on it for a few sessions about what it could be. And that's what led us to going and finding Crash Dish and talking to him, because he knows Goblin. He was able to read the map and kind of help us along. So kind of gave us that information, kind of gave us a basic idea of where it was going to be. Then we ended up meeting the Hermit, and the Hermit told us explicitly where it was. It's like, hey, it's specifically right here on the map, which saved us a lot of issues, because Crash Dish or the map itself only gave a very sort of generic idea of where it might be. So we could have spent a lot of time searching for that hidden oasis hideout, but that Hermit gave us very good directions directly to it. So banknotes are one of my favorite ones, and usually if I roll banknote, I'll roll another d6 on this money for how much the banknote is for. So banknotes are, what's the best way to explain them? We don't really have a modern day equivalent, because they're sort of, the banknotes are kind of the precursor of personal checks, lines of credit. So basically, you would give if you had liquid wealth, so cash money, you would give it to a mint. The mint would hold it, and the mint would also would issue back to you like pieces of paper that kind of look like physical stocks certificates. And they would be it would say, hey, this is worth a certain amount of money that you can get back from the mint. So if you show up to us with these banknotes from this person, we'll give you the money that he has in the account. And so that's sort of how the banknote works. And so that is sort of like the precursor of how we have paper money now, and how we got to that sort of point, and how personal checks work and things like that. So there's some sort of guarantor that money is there, but it also means, like, if you want to go make a big purchase, like we know in here, just because I'm going to flip it all the way open. But say you want to go buy something like a sailing ship in D&D, well, that's tens of thousands of gold. So you have tens of thousands of gold that, what are you going to do, carry it around in like big wagons? No, you go and put that money in the mint, and then you have a whole bunch of, you have your certificate worth so much, and then you go up to the shipwright and you're like, hey, here, the shipbuilding company, here is your money. And they go, oh, great. And then they can go get it from the bank, whatever they want. So usually you do it in sort of like, just like how paper money works, in different sort of amounts. So that's a lot of dumb history about sort of mints and banknotes, and how we got to sort of our modern paper money and banking in general, because mints turned into banks, basically. So that's how that works. But why I like banknotes is that you can give them something that's worth monetary money later for players. It's like, hey, this could be worth a lot of money, but you have to go to a certain place to actually go get that money, or find somebody who's willing to trade that banknote for money. So some sort of moneylenders will do that. So they'll, of course, take their cut and be like, oh, I have this banknote for, let's say, 10 gold pieces. Great, the moneylender's like, here, absolutely, I will take a 10% cut. I will give you 9 hard gold coins for your 10 gold banknote. So they take their cut for themselves, and you get the hard cash that you can spend on anything without having to go to the place, because these are physical locations that issue these banknotes, so you might have to go to a different city. We've come across some of those in the solo RPG series. I think we had some Carjuntan banknotes, so I ended up taking it back there, and it's not really worth like a full scene. It's just like, hey, we can convert the banknotes into money now, so we go do that. Contracts are fun. They can be sort of like legal contracts. It could be charters to work a mine, something like that, some sort of like property notice. Sometimes that falls under papers too. I use that under just generic papers too. But it could be a contract of work. Could tell you. It could be sort of a contract with some sort of fiend, something of that nature. Maybe like a warlock packed in blood, something like that you can come across. So those are really, really fun. Any other contracts? It could be like a delivery contract. So if you maybe you jump, you're doing evil base smuggling operation, and you find a contract for a delivery that hasn't gone through yet, and you're like, well, now we have the opportunity to pretend we're these smugglers, and we could show up with that stuff and have our plan, and maybe find out a little bit more about sort of the evil people behind the smuggling ring. You can do things, right? They kind of spin, the idea is that these are really helpful to sort of spin off your own little side adventures if you want to. If not, you can make it something that's totally silly, like, hey, this is a receipt for a receipt for delivery from the mine. You're like, that's great, but it doesn't actually, it's not worth anything to me. It just kind of tells me a little bit of history and context about the dungeon itself. Directions, yep. I mean, works just like a map. Directions are nice to give. That works really well, like I said, with the situation I did in the solo RPG series, where I gave them something that was in Goblin that I knew they wouldn't be able to, RPCs wouldn't be able to read. They'd have to go find somebody with. So if you find Goblin directions, it also is a good way to sort of highlight characters who take those very specific languages from a DM or GM perspective, so they can sort of step forward and be like, oh, I know how to read this. And so it's like, well, thank goodness we had the person who could read Gnomish, because if we didn't have that, we'd have to go back to the city and pay somebody probably to read this for us. And probably like a Scrivener or something, a scribe, to take it and then transliterate it into Common or something that we could use. Because the thing itself is, the directions itself, the document is not worth value, it's the information that's worth the value. So we could do that and burn that or throw it away or whatever. Lists or notes. Lists or notes I really like. It kind of give you an idea of sort of what's in the dungeon, helps you telegraph things. Like you can do notes for, let's see, we have the orcs in a dungeon. Hey, remember, don't open the door with the X on it because it's, and maybe that's all it says. Reminder, don't open the door with the X on it. And because it's an extra dumb guy who needs a little note pinned to his tunic to remember to do things like that. And so if they find the door with the X on it, they know that there's something bad behind that. Could be notes like, hey, this is a great way, I like to use these specifically to give answers to puzzles if I'm going to put like a puzzle in a dungeon. So one of the problems that I've talked about it before, but one of the problems I have with puzzles is that they challenge the players. It's the only really thing in D&D that explicitly challenges players rather than player characters, and it doesn't feel good to have characters with really high wisdom, really high intelligence, and not be able to figure out a really simple puzzle. It doesn't feel good. It kind of takes you out of that fantasy. So I like to also make sure that there's, some bad guy out there walking around that has the solution written down their pocket, because they're also too dumb to figure it out. And so if they find the note and then they go back to the door, then go like, oh, now we have the answer, right? It's red, blue, yellow, or whatever the puzzle is. Or it can be a thing where they can find the note first and be like, oh, what is this? But if they decide to hang on to it, when they find the puzzle, they're like, thank goodness I remembered that, because now I can input the answer. Or they can be like, oh, obviously this is what was supposed to be, what that note was talking about. And then they sit around, they're like, can I remember what was on the note? No, now we gotta go back, and now I'm rolling random encounter dice for, like, as each sort of dungeon chamber they move through before they get back to the spot where that note is. Just, to increase the threat that because they didn't take it with them, now they have to spend more time in the dungeon, which means it provides more of a threat to them, that they're gonna get found out by dungeon denizens and get into fights or conflicts of some type with them. Or more challenges that they need to like sneak around and do things like that. Directions and map, we already talked about that. Passes and papers. This is going to be a really interesting thing. You come across sort of identification, maybe it's travel papers, a pass that allows, hunting in the King's Forest, any sort of permission, things like that. It could be like we said, a charter for a mine, or maybe it's the deed of ownership for a boat or something like that. You can find the ownership deed for a home, a property in town, which is a cool way to set up If you want to set up a base of operations, if you want to play that style of D&D game, so it's not full hobo in the murder hobo. Now it's murder homeowners instead. So they have a place that they can kind of set up as their own little base, and they can decorate it and get servants and do all that stuff that players like to do when they get some sort of physical space that they can claim ownership over in sort of perpetuity. Those are fun things to throw in. Especially, it's a really good thing to do, obviously, if you want your players to hang around in the specific little sandbox area for a while. Is give them a way to plop down like a little bit of property that they need to get in order or something like that, or they need to find a seller for if they don't want it. And so maybe that just kind of takes some time. So it kind of keeps them in the area. But yeah, that's sort of my pocket contents table. Super easy. So we've had our dungeon chamber contents, we did our biome variation, we did our pocket contents. And even though I call this a pocket contents table, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's only things that can be found in pockets. It's just random stuff, your tchotchkes and small items you might find anywhere. They could be tucked into a desk, they could be on a shelf, they could be hidden somewhere, they could be discarded, like laying on the table or something. Getting knocked off the table, maybe it's in the trash. There's some sort of waste repository. Hidden in a bag under some grain or something like that. Maybe there's a bunch of sacks of flour or something like that, and maybe there's, well, let's just roll. What's under those sacks of grain? 2. Alright, so 2 is an everyday carry. And handkerchief. Alright, well, why would there be a handkerchief under these sacks of flour? So it might be valuable. It might have some like golden thread in it or something like that. Let's roll a d6 to determine sort of like monetarily. So I rolled a 4, so that's sort of middle of the road. So it's as far as sort of value, rather than looking at that specific value. It's not a 7 gold piece handkerchief. It's more like, it's a nice silk embroidered handkerchief. Like, this is something fine. But it's not fine enough that somebody needs to hide it this way. So there must be some other sort of significance about it. Maybe it's about the monogram, what's initialed on it. The letters that are monogrammed onto the handkerchief. And it's silk. Maybe this is somebody that one of the denizens shouldn't know about. Maybe it's some sort of lovers, cross classes, or I don't know what the dungeon is, or something of that nature. Maybe it'll be helpful for them. Like we said, if it was like that fey ghost wood, maybe this is a handkerchief from one of the people who've died in here, and so maybe they can show it to a ghost, and maybe if that's the right ghost, then you can put that spirit at ease, and the ghost, you don't have to fight the ghost, and the ghost just completely deconstitutes. It just shimmers and flies away. Put it rest by giving them the handkerchief, or burying it with their body, or whatever it is. Maybe it can be its own little adventure, right? If you want to spin it out and do it that way. Very stupid, simple to use. But again, kind of showcasing, like, it doesn't have to be something that's in a pocket. It's just the sort of items that people would have on them. So it's the sort of things that are probably around all the time, but we're not focusing on it most of the time. So the idea being that if we focus on it as being treasure, then it must be important in some way. It must have value, whether that's monetary value or value because it gives us some sort of insight to what's going on, or helps make us progress through the dungeon a little bit easier. Same thing with the clothing and the scarf, right? The scarf that somebody used to cover their face, and it's got mold or pollen or whatever all over it. So now we know that there's sort of a poisonous mold room that's coming up, and that kind of keys us into that and what to do about it. Let's do one more. I think we got time for one more. Yeah, we got time for one more. Well, technically it's 2d6 plus 1d6. Random DCs. This is going to be a pretty specific to 5e, but could be used for other systems. You're just going to need to do some noodling on the chart. You're just going to have to change the values on the chart a little bit. So if you guys have watched the solo RPG series, you've probably seen me say, oh, right, I rolled a 17 perception. Is that going to be enough? And you've probably seen me do that and then go, Yeah, that's enough. And tell you, oh, that's a DC 11. And I think a lot of people assume that I'm adding up the dice, but we can add up the dice, and that total that's 9. That's not 11. So what's the difference? It's because these 3 dice are not created equally. I'm not adding them up together. I'm actually adding these first 2 for a table, and then adding this number to it. So let me show you how I do that for sort of random things. Whether that's me GMing and the players have asked for something that I don't know anything about and I don't have a room DC set already or something like that, then I do that. I also use this when I'm setting my room DCs, generally. Doing that. But I use a lot in the solo RPG because I don't know... If I'm asking something that I don't know, haven't already prepped, and I need to improvise a DC for, I find it very easy to roll this. And I can roll this, and then I can look at the result. And the result, I say, that doesn't feel right. It gives me a better, even if I don't use that number, it gives me a better idea in my mind what now does feel like the right DC for it, even if I don't use it. So, again, I roll it just like any random chart. The idea is that you're rolling it to give you inspiration. You're not locking yourself into the result, necessarily. Because if I roll it and it doesn't feel right, I'm not going to use something that doesn't feel right for the game. Like if they're like, I want to jump over this bar, over this acid pit, and use it to swing across. And I go, all right, yeah, that perfectly sounds like an athletics check. And then I go over here and I'm going to roll my dice. And I go, okay, well, DC 14, does that feel right for an athletics check? And it's like, yeah, the pool doesn't feel that big. Yeah, that feels fine. Yeah, maybe that athletics check let you know it's DC 14 so you can determine with how good you are at athletics whether you feel like you can do that or not. Trying to use some transparency with the DC because otherwise players have an idea of how good maybe their character might be at athletics, but not necessarily a great way to judge how difficult the situation might be in comparison. So sometimes it can be helpful to just give them the DC up front for something like that, so they can use it in sort of their judging. They'll go, oh, well, I only have like a +2 to athletics, so maybe jumping across seems kind of dangerous. Maybe I need some sort of assistance, maybe get some guidance, maybe we use a rope of some kind, something like that to give them an edge, give them some advantage, that extra D4 from guidance to swing across. So let's make the chart. And I don't think I want to do that. 0. So this is like very easy. I'm just going to stick with the basics. 3 through 4. 5 through 9. 10. Medium. 5, 10, and then that's 15 for hard. And then 12 is 20. Very hard. Plus 1d6. Double if proficiency is required. Because there are some things I believe that you really can't attempt to do if you're not proficient in it. Like, things that fall into that for my mind are things like picking locks. All right, well, in my mind, you can't attempt to pick a lock if you don't already know how to pick a lock. So the proficiency is required just to make the check. And so I'm going to double the DC because this is a lot different. So if you want to, taking the previous example, if you want to jump over the acid pit using athletics, well, you don't necessarily need to be trained in athletics to jump over a pit. Everybody knows how to jump. But something like pick a lock, somebody who might have high dexterity but doesn't know how to use lock picks, probably not going to be able to pick a lock because they don't know what they're doing. But somebody who does already is always going to have that bonus added to it. So they're always going to have a higher check result anyway, so that's sort of just why I double the proficiency. Double this 1d6 on the back. So let's do those same. So we did sort of the DC for the acid pit. Let's do the same thing for lock picking. So we're going to pick this lock. The rogue's going to try to pick the lock. Right, that's a 7, so a base 10. So that would be a 14. But if we double this, that's 18. You go, whoop. And then I think about it. Okay, DC 18. Does that feel right? Oh, that feels a little high. Okay, so sometimes I'll do, this is another sort of icy RPG hack. We can do sort of a plus or minus 3. It just kind of gives you a little saving grace there at the end. 18 feels a little high, so let me knock 3 off of it. 15. 15 feels right. Then they roll their check. Let's say that they are trained in it, so they'll get to add those. 18, yeah. But they did it. And if they didn't, they go, oh, well, this lock's beyond me, or something's buggered in it. It's rusted, or it's seized up. I can't unlock it, and now we're gonna have to break it down. And now I go, okay, so you want to break down the door instead? All right, let's look at that. Well, you certainly don't need to be trained in anything to break down the door. So DC 11. Ooh, DC 11 feels right. That's 8, so that's 10 plus 1, 11, and we don't double it because anybody can break down the door. DC 11. Does 11 feel right? Well, my initial answer would be no. We should up it a little to DC 14. But then I think about it for a second and go, no, well, if the lock's seized up, so maybe this is a door that's not in very good condition, so maybe it's already kind of shabby. So maybe 11 is easy enough to break it down. And then let them do whatever checks they want to do. If they just want to bull rush it, just common strength check. Maybe they use a crowbar, have some friends help. And then probably fail to break down the door because they didn't roll very well. But sure, maybe they have guidance. Why not? That's only 8 plus whatever their bonus is. I mean, yeah, they probably have a bonus of 3. Yeah. Whoever's probably attempting that is probably the strongest character in the party. So yeah, they make it, but just barely. It's not a good showing from our strength-oriented character. They really have to like huff and puff to get it done, and everybody's kind of like, feels like it should have been a little bit easier than that. So maybe that's a little sheepish RP moment. I'm going to drop that in. So yeah, that's sort of how I come up with DCs on the fly. It's all really, really quite simple. So those were the 4 that I wanted to get through. I wanted to see... I thought that these would take a little bit longer, but they're... I guess because they're so sort of self-explanatory. There's not a ton of reason to sort of spend too much time on them. So I'm trying to think if there's another sort of small table I want to add to this that I can think of off the top of my head. That would be a good one. Primarily a 2d6, which I don't think I have a ton of other 2d6 specific tables. And I usually don't use them for just my standard random encounter like wilderness or dungeon tables. But if I'm going to make a custom one, I might. Sometimes I do it. I guess the only other 2d6 one that I would add that I don't have in here, but I do sometimes use, is sort of a reaction roll. So let's do a sort of 2d6 reaction roll. So reaction roll tables. This is one of the things that is another one of those old school D&D things that kind of don't get used a lot anymore. They don't come up very often, but are very crucial, especially if you run sort of a high randomness or highly improvised game. It can be really helpful if you do a lot of random encounters and things like that. It can be helpful because one of the reasons I use try to use the nomenclature creature instead of monster, is because I feel like monsters generally you're supposed to fight. It feels indicative with the language. They kind of lead you towards that conclusion, and I want there also to be lots of negotiation and things like that. Lots of creatures you can talk to and interact with in a non-hostile manner. So usually if I have a 2d6 table, I put usually the worst things at the bottom. So if you roll a 2, they're just hostile. You come across creatures, they're just immediately hostile to you. So anytime I use a table like this, I think a good way to do it is be like, okay, you see a band of orc raiders on a hilltop nearby as you kind of pass out of the forest. Alright, I do an insight check. Okay, you do an insight check. What is the sort of read you get on them? Alright, I rolled a 6. And I'd be like, okay. Maybe I'll roll another one. Just be like, hey, is it docile or avoidant? Okay, docile. They watch you. But they seem... Maybe docile's not right. Let's say comfortable. They seem neutral. They seem happy enough. They don't look like they're about to ride down on you. I was assuming they were on horseback for some reason. These sort of raiders are on the hilltop watching you pass. They're not brandishing weapons. They're not trying to go towards you. They didn't see you and start going the other direction. They seem happy to stand where they are and sort of watch you for right now. Depending on your group might be cool. I take out my longbow and shoot them. Or it might be, oh well, maybe we should keep an eye out. Keep an eye out. Then maybe there's an ambush down the road or something. Or they might decide to try and go talk to them. And again, they're sort of neutral, so of course they might be a super sort of avoidant. All right, if you're an armed party and you see another armed party going by in a different direction, and then they clock you and turn and start coming towards you, you might ready yourself. That would be a pretty natural reaction. Or you might decide to move back. Or they might send, one rider forward and kind of hold up their hands for you to stop, and, you could do a little exchange, and somebody from your party comes forward, and the two of them can talk. And try to figure out what each one is about, and that's a cool way to do sort of a scene with a random scene with the creatures or monsters that you might otherwise not get an opportunity to do, just running sort of straightforward D&D. It's like, you see orcs on horseback, okay, we attack or try to run away from them. It's like, no, well, you could also, they don't seem hostile, but they don't seem friendly. They don't seem particularly curious or helpful, but they don't seem like aggressive. I put mischievous in there with aggressive because that can be a lot more useful when you come across things that are like fey or fiendish, instead of having them just immediately go into like a fight. Maybe they're just sort of like playing practical jokes or things like that. It's more mischief. They're just kind of, screwing with you. They're not really trying to hurt you. But they can also just be annoying. And then they can be outright hostile. So let's roll again until we get something else for that same orc party. So you're going to get a lot of neutral outcomes. So you have to be kind of okay with that. If you're rolling it in like a dungeon or something and it's this creature's home, well, if there are a bunch of armed people going through your home, you're probably not neutral or friendly towards them. Probably not. I mean, you might be. It kind of depends on what that creature is and the context of where they are. Alright, well, come on. So, for the orc raiders, I kind of put everybody in the neutral area, so it doesn't feel like anybody's put upon. 4, okay. We know they're going to be aggressive. So, party's traveling, they break that tree line, they see orc riders up on the hillside, also clock them. Maybe they give like a few sort of like war whoops. And maybe, aggressive, right? They're not necessarily being straight up hostile. Doing some posturing, they're, beating their chest, doing some war whoops, war cries, a few toots on a horn or something like that, and maybe they're whirling their horses around trying to whip themselves sort of into a frenzy to say like, hey, if you come any closer, we're going to come after you. Right? Aggressive can also be very defensive in that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to ride down and immediately attack. Just be like, hey, you guys are way too close. You guys need to move away from us. We're just trying, in the same way that a dog barks at the mailman, right? There's something like that. It's the bark before the bite is what we're talking about. So that can be sort of the aggressive aspect of it. Or, right, you could go the mischievous route where they just sort of harry. Maybe they follow the party for a little bit on horseback. They harry them. They get close. They maybe sling a few rocks around the party. Just to fuck with them, right? They're not really trying to hit them. They're like skipping rocks off around the party. They're obviously not trying to hit them. They're just being a nuisance. Being bullies, basically. Same sort of thing. You can do those sorts of things. Which can kind of bait the party into a fight, right? They might be trying to bait the party into a fight, and the party decides that they want to run after them if they're using ranged weapons to sort of harry them, and they're on horseback. They wait for the party to get close. They probably get one round of ranged attacks in before the melee party members can get up to the horses. And as they do, they just disengage and run away with their faster speed to stay at sort of the outskirts and just kind of keep whipping stones at them. But if the players decide that they let it go and then go back along their way, maybe they come back and harry them a little bit more. And maybe they only do it for a few minutes, maybe they do it for a few hours, kind of tracking the party, and then, maybe they kind of fart off and go back to whatever they were doing beforehand. Maybe they only follow you for a mile or two, and then they wheel their horses around and kick their heels into the flanks and head off back the way they came from. So you can add those sorts of fun little things in there. So again, it's kind of hard to use in a dungeon. So let's say, but we can also use this to inform what shows up at the random, what sort of random creature we come across. So if we did our 2d6 dungeon chamber contents and we got, let's roll till we get a creature. Oh, there we go. So it's got a creature and a hot in it, both and a pretty major treasure in there. So if we had that, and so say we're in maybe some sort of, I was going with humanoids because they're super easy. So let's say it's within some sort of like owlbear layer or something like that. We're like, okay, how's the owlbear feel about this? Okay, 5 through 6, they're curious. And you could go with that. You could be like, oh, you show up at the outskirts of the owlbear's den and maybe they haven't seen people before, they're curious about it, they've never seen anybody in sort of armor before, so they kind of are looking at it, they're trying to figure out like what sort of creature that is. They're not initially clocking them as sort of a threat. Maybe. But you could also just be like, no, that doesn't make sense. I'm going to roll again, or I'm going to choose something else. They go, okay, yeah, they're kind of off-put. This is their lair. We're assuming it's their lair, so they're not going to be avoidant. But they do see comfortable. That's sort of way that animals are like, just kind of watch you, but are kind of okay with how far away you are from them. And then once you hit basically their aggro zone, they change into that fight or flight mode. And they decide whether they're going to get more aggressive, or they're going to be more friendly, or avoidant. Yeah, I mean, those are most of my 2d6 tables that I use on a regular basis. They're super useful. I think you will find them very useful for your own games. I use this one all the time. I'm literally using it to try. Like I said, I'm figuring out the system for doing a sort of first-person dungeon crawling as iterative as I can, so I don't have to like go get a map and then know how many chambers are in it. And no, it's kind of hard to spoil yourself on like secret doors and things like that when you're pulling a space that you can fully visualize and see before you. It takes a little bit takes some of the surprise out of it as much. So I'm trying to keep as much of that in as possible with the solo RPG stuff, so that way we're not just kind of making things fit into a box. We're trying to figure out the dimensions of the box as we go along. I think that's gonna be probably everything, though. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we need to talk about. So we will do the solo RPG next time. I just have to finish tweaking out what I've got. I feel like I'm very close, so I'm gonna have that ready to go, so that way I don't have to prep a full dungeon map for where we're going next. So it's gonna be a lot of fun. Other things we need to talk about. Not much. If you're in the US, we have a major holiday coming up, 4th of July, Independence Day. So make sure you guys have a good weekend, and be safe from heat and fireworks. Please don't set things on fire, and it's hot, or at least it's hot where I am in the country. I think that's it. We don't really have a lot else going on, I don't think. Yeah, I think that's it. I've been testing out the dungeon crawl thing with the mazes stuff I got from Free RPG Day. Still loving it. I wish now that I've messed with it a little bit, I wish I knew a little bit more about the system, because I feel like there's parts of it that I don't really understand how to use the spell casting character based off of what we had. What was given in sort of like the Free RPG Day, but I'm still very interested in mazes and I want to learn more about it. It's hard to look in the price tag, because if I want to get it, I want to get the physical version, which is quite expensive, and the PDF is most of that cost by itself. So there's not a super easy way to kind of get into it other than kind of drop some money blind on it, which is, I don't know, because I don't know enough about the system from the quick start to kind of make that decision. I think I'd like it, and I think it's something that I found very useful for running a group very quickly. As a solo RPG, I could run the whole group with just a handful of dice and their little character sheets. Very easy, so I do want to do more of it. I just have to get myself over that hill to be like, hey, I need to buy a copy of Mazes for myself, I guess. And if I do that, I want the hardback, so Maybe I'll buy it for myself as a treat. I have maybe some treat money coming up soon, so maybe I'll do that. I'll spend that on myself and get that. We have the blog, redragonfiend.com. You can follow us over on Twitter. Of course, we have the videos, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that already and like the video. And share it on your favorite social media or Reddit or TTRPG forums. That's always really helpful to get it sort of in front of other people that you think might also find other DMs and GMs in your life who might also find tables like this very useful. Obviously, very sort of fantasy focused, very sort of D&D-esque focused, but a lot of these could be used with any system. Something like the NPC reaction roll you can use from anything from modern day, sci-fi, anything of that nature. The DCs are very 5e tuned, but you could do, if you can figure out, there's usually a table in almost every RPG book that's going to give you what sort of the easy, medium, and hard difficulty levels are, whether that's dice pool target numbers or something like that, and you can adjust this to probably work with that. Same thing with the pocket contents. Obviously, it's a little sci-fi bound, but if you could very easily probably make this for modern day if you wanted to. Like here, let me just roll one real randomly. How to use this for a modern day? 6 and 1. All right. So a banknote. You find a credit card. Done. Right, very easy to sort of transfer that to something that's modern day. If you want to do sci-fi, it's a cred stick. Same thing with dungeon chamber contents. If you want to do that for spaceships, very easy to do. If you say we had that severe hot and treasure, let's just use this one. You're on a spaceship and something's gone wrong with that spaceship. Maybe it could be a vacuum suck to the outside. It could be maybe there's some sort of like electrical fire that's going on, or maybe there's fluid that's down and it's electrified. So you got to figure some way to sort of get across that chamber. But there's also something that's kind of useful in there that you can see. Maybe it's ammunition for one of your guns, or maybe it looks like a data pad or something that you can grab that's going to give you a clue. Maybe it's a key card that you can see hanging off a corpse is floating in the air. Maybe it's anti-grav, floating in the air, and you can see the key card hanging off a key from their belt. Very easy to use it, even for non-D&D kind of stuff. For whatever genre you want to play it in. So all these are going to be useful. Probably not the Biome variation table. that's very specifically hex crawly. So you're going to have to be running a fantasy hex crawl for the most part to make use of this one. But that works for. You could be doing this for D&D. You could be doing it for Pathfinder. You could be doing it for Dungeon World. You could be doing it for a whole bunch of different systems in which hex crawling is going to play a part. Then you have this table and it will work for you. But that's enough talking for me. I'm done. And I will talk to you guys next time. Alright? Bye.